Our next speaker studied and practiced yoga and meditation for decades. Mathie holds a master's degree in the traditions of yoga and meditation, as well as studies in the Sanskrit language. Anne's childhood and family life positively formed the foundation for her life goals and her success in reaching those goals. She was born into a loving Scottish-Japanese family and learned from her parents about theosophy and Buddhism, and especially from their telling of their own Kuṇḍalinī awakenings. And as a bit of an aside here, Anne was given her name in recognition of Annie Besant. Some of you may recognize that as the activist, author, and second president of the Theosophical Society. Certainly an intelligent, forceful role model for Anne. During Anne's 20s, she experienced Kuṇḍalinī awakening for several years and believes that the examples, the thoughts, and the teachings of her parents prepared her for a Kuṇḍalinī process without Western medical intervention. The implications of that are profound. Anne has long been an explorer and an adventurer, and she toured through the Himalayas, through Europe, the United Kingdom, and also Mexico, all the while absorbing sacred history and rituals, and at the same time practicing her yoga and meditation. Over the years, she's been a student of many heart-driven studies, including social justice, nutrition, and sustainability, and she rose to teach in those subjects, in addition to teaching yoga and meditation. All of this is combined with her study of yoga traditions has reinforced for Anne her conviction that ancient knowledge needs to be recognized and incorporated into our 21st century studies of mind. She's always sought to be a student and a bridge and a teacher to meld together East and West, science and spirit, ancient and modern. Anne is about to give us a fascinating talk, which comes from both her studies and her personal experience. We're fortunate to have her here with her talk about paths of transcendence. Anne, on behalf of everyone, I welcome you. I'll hand the conference over to you, and I will advise you as time grows short.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for your introduction. Can you hear me okay? Is it all good on the sound front?
Yes, it's fine.
Excellent. Okay. Lawrence, that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you for your authenticity. And yeah, that gave me goosebumps for some of your stories. Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay. So I would like to talk about preliminary practices on the path to transcendence in Eastern traditions. I would like to talk about insights and the psychological changes which can happen during spontaneous Kuṇḍalinī awakenings, as well as through meditation practice. And I'd also like to talk about what happens to our psychology when we deepen our insights into the nature of reality. I want to frame this with the Eastern philosophy of mind in Sāṃkhya philosophy, Sāṃkhya Metaphysics, as well as in Buddhism. I'm choosing these two philosophies. I'm going to be using the Yoga Sutras and Buddhist texts. They're very similar. A lot of their theories are very similar. That's why I'm going to be using these two. Obviously, there are differences, but I won't go into the technicalities of those in this talk. Most importantly, throughout this, I want to talk about the significance of refining one's behavior when we start to access deeper states of the mind. So taking agency, taking responsibility for our own actions, behaviors, thoughts, speech. So part of that will be talking about preliminary practices on the path, upaya in the yogic tradition. So that means skillful means, same in the Buddhist tradition as well, but a graduated means towards accessing subtler states of consciousness, as well as how can we safeguard against certain psychological hindrances which commonly arise in deep meditation states. We're going to summarize that with the responsibility of spiritual teachers and how within the tradition are people guided through this path. And the impact behavior has on the propagation of enlightenment in society. So without further ado, I shall get into the talk. I want to give you a bit of background where this information is coming from. So predominantly all the theory that I'm going to be speaking of is from ancient Indian texts. So this is a conversation of literature, sages, saints over 2,000 years. The particular texts I'm going to be focusing on are the Sāṃkhya and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, as well that the yogic, the theory transforms later into tantric, and then you see it again in a lot of Vedanta. You see it also in many traditions across India over the ages, but you also see it merge with Buddhism in Vajrayana Buddhism. I'm going to be talking about the Visuddhimagga, which is an early Buddhist text, and the Pali Canon. So these have very, very similar ideologies behind practice. I'll explain each one as I go through it. So the texts are often based on the direct experience of saints, and often there'll be commentaries around these direct experiences. So a text will become popular, there'll be lots of commentaries on it, people will be practicing the techniques and coming up with new text to go into more depth with the techniques. I've also done a lot of phenomenological investigation, so interviews with practitioners, as well as looking into the experiences of saints from our past. I want to combine this with current Western therapeutic practices and neuroscience. Something, from my own direct experience, observing psychology and culture from the East and the West, these two ways of thinking can sometimes be quite different. So I have observed that sometimes practices get lost in translation when they come over to the East. So I want to bring in a bit of current Western therapeutic practices and how can we resolve our own personal issues as we walk this path. Okay, so I just want to summarize some of the things that happen in spontaneous Kuṇḍalinī awakenings, as well as deep meditation practices. So what we have is sometimes people out of nowhere have a spiritual experience with no context, no background knowledge, no background information. It just happens for a number of reasons. On the end of the scale, we have people who've been practicing for years and years and years with ardent concentration techniques, and they're able to access deeper parts of the psyche. These two experiences are often very, very similar. So I'll go through a few of them. I've kind of made each page to kind of describe the category of each of these experiences, and I'm sure you've heard them lots before. So energetic experience, energy moving through the body, electricity moving through the body, heightened sensitivity to sensory awareness, heightened sensitivity to an emotional awareness. Your subconscious starts to arise to the conscious. Not all of these happen, but some of them can happen. All of them can happen depending on the individual. Old behavior patterns can arise. PTSD, post-traumatic stress, can arise. Conditioning, old conditioning can arise to the surface. You can also start to see connectivity or patterns in the external world. We start to see synchronicities occur in our external environment, along with blissful states, a connection with God, the deity, spiritual feeling, kriyas, spontaneous physical movements. Now, the notion that usually accompanies spiritual awakening is a feeling that there is an intelligence behind this. It's a force or an intelligence that comes along with this spontaneous experience, the spiritual experience. Unfortunately, these aspects are not really catered for in the West. When people have these experiences, they're considered maybe a psychosis or a mania in Western psychology. We are having a psychedelic renaissance right now in the West, so a lot of these transpersonal experiences are being explored in more detail. Now, what can happen if the ego or there isn't a framework for these experiences? These synchronicities can present themselves as though the person is having a God-like experience. This can turn into delusions of grandeur for the individual, and if not held appropriately, this can cause a kind of a hindrance to meditation. I will talk about this in much more detail and how can we prevent these things from occurring. we have also awareness of very subtle states: clairvoyance, clairaudience, visions of other planes, astral projection, and easy lucid dreaming as well. Other states. Now, this is where we start to enter into a more guided or sometimes deeper awakenings. You have a sense of purpose. You feel you're being guided. This can be a bit blurry at first, but it becomes a lot clearer as to what you're supposed to be doing and where you're supposed to be going. A strong sense of service can arise. This is very common. When people reach states of the Buddhic mind, compassion can arise. This is challenging in that you can feel the pain of others in a very visceral way. This is the means to cultivate compassion. Your sense of self or identity can dissolve. Your connections with friends and family start to dissolve. These interactions you have with people start to change. Your normal human attachments start to change. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail. So your social constructs start to dissolve. The whole awakening process is a dissolution of the self. When we are operating in our social conditions, this can be quite difficult to assimilate. Now, these can turn into stream entry states. This is what the Buddhists will call these 4 stream entry states, the path to full awakening. These are states where you experience emptiness in everything. So the whole body, the whole mind, the whole sense of self completely dissolves. In Buddhism, they say your first stream entry state would be your first experience of disillusion. Once you've had that, you enter a path, a stream entry, that's what they call it. You are pulled along to enlightenment. Circumstances and conditions will take you there in 7 lifetimes at least. That's what it says in the text. The dark night of the soul, this is a challenging one. We'll talk about this in much more detail. This is the process of transformation, the letting go part. This can be difficult. This can be challenging. This has been documented in Buddhist texts, and I'll talk about this in more detail as well. Visions of death, dissolving, decaying. These all sound very morbid, but I can assure you the outcome is for a very beautiful means to transcendence, transcending the egoic self. And that's something we're going to talk about in detail. And this is described in the 16 stages of insight in Buddhist texts. So let's talk about what liberation is in the Eastern traditions, or enlightenment, let's say. So freedom from contractions of the mind. No more craving or aversion ever arises again. A permanent cessation of craving and aversion. In Buddhism, this is seeing the emptiness in nature, experiences of disillusion. In yoga, liberation is dissolving the most gross aspects of the self into the most subtle. And I will start by describing the yoga metaphysics of how this happens. So the reason I want to describe this metaphysics, because it frames the experience and it frames why certain preliminary practices are really, really important to get a healthy, balanced way to disillusion and to function in society. So within Sāṃkhya philosophy, we have Purusha, which is pure consciousness. So I have talked about this before on a previous talk with you guys, but I'm going to add different caveats. We're going to turn this more into yoga psychology. We're going to look at the function of the ego within the Sāṃkhya system. Purusha can sometimes, it's later evolved into Shiva. Prakriti later evolved into Shakti in the tantric traditions. But in Sāṃkhya, Purusha is pure awareness, no thought, no activity. It's just awareness. There's no mechanisms here. It's just awareness. There's no seeing, there's no action, there's no motivation, there's no agency. It's just awareness. Prakriti is materiality. It's action, it's manifestation, it's matter, it's thought, it's everything that the universe is. It's all of samsara. It's everything that we know, see, act, feel, touch, taste, think. Everything is Prakriti. And it unfolds in a differentiated manner from its most purest subtle vibration into its most dense form. And there's a manner in which it unfolds. Now, what is really important is that the self, the psychology, the makeup of the individual follows the same structure as the universe, as the manifest universe. We are the universe is the self, the mind is the universe is the mind. So when we look at yoga psychology, this is what we are looking into: consciousness, the nature of consciousness. So I want to talk about Prakriti. Prakriti, the gunas, the manifestation of the self. So Prakriti is made up of the gunas. These are forces that interact with each other. They make up everything that is physical, mental, emotional, and they manifest, as I said, from the most subtle and they divide into the most gross, physical. These forces are sattva, rajas, and tamas. These can be seen as energies, forces, intentions, vibrations, and they have a character to them. Each of them have a character. So sattva is the energy of clarity, form, lightness, purity. It also refers to states of mind as well. It can also refer to a substance. So you can have a sattvic thought, which would be generous, pure, kind. You can have sattvic food, which would be fresh fruit, cleanliness of the house. These are all very pure, light, vibrational aspects or qualities. We're talking about, those are qualities. Rajas is energy, like fire, excitement, activity, combustion. In the human, it can be determination or anger, depending on how much tamas is in it. Eagerness, impatience, ginger, garlic, alcohol, stimulating drugs. These are all rajasic energies. So these forces are influencing the creation of mind and matter all the time. Tamas is solidity, form, earth. It can be anger, it can be fear, it can be sloth, it can be selfishness, aversion, alcohol, drugs, meat, oily foods, rotten foods. These are tamasic elements. These are in the mind. Thoughts can be tamasic, a substance can be tamasic, and aspects of the self can become tamasic. Okay, so they are descriptive words that describe the nature of Prakriti. So our self differentiates into different tattvas, they're called. These are aspects of the self, from pure, subtle Buddhic elements into gross material elemental forms. So the earliest we really see this is in a mention in of the Panchakoshas in the Taittiriya Upanishads. But they only really mention them. They don't go into much detail, but you see an evolution of this gradated form of the self, from the most subtle to the most dense to the most flesh. This chart, sorry, it looks very technical. We have Purusha on one side. That's always animating. So Prakriti is animated. It's like Prakriti is just dancing for Purusha to witness it. That is its motive. It doesn't have a motive. It's just materiality manifesting itself. It starts with sattvic. Mula Prakriti is just potentiality waiting to burst into action. The first thing to form is the buddhi. This is just part of the mind, which is the pure reflection of consciousness. It's sattva. It's still a substance, but it's sattva. It's very sattvic, very pure reflection. It starts to collapse because of the influence of rajas coming in, the energy of rajas coming in, and that creates the ahamkara, the ego. The ego has a way of drawing everything into itself. It's the first formation of the self, or the identity, self-identity. What extrapolates from that are the sense organs, or the mind starts to move, the organs of action, objects of observation, so like what you smell, what you see, what you touch, as well as the senses to go with that. So this is the basic structure. The tattvas are the Sāṃkhya means to count, the 25 tattvas which make up the entirety of the self. Buddhi, the most subtle, or Mula Prakriti, complete disillusion, and the elements of earth, water, fire, wind, and the fifth, ether. I want to talk about the antakarana. Okay, so the top layers, the most subtle layers of our identity, our connection with the most subtle aspects of the universe of the self, lie in buddhi, ahamkara, and manas. These are the top bits. So remember, buddhi was just that pure reflection, that sattvic pure reflection of consciousness. Ahamkara is the ego forming, manas is the mind thinking. Okay, this is the ahamkara, the reflexive eye maker, like a prism. It draws in the light and it differentiates it into different aspects of the self. Okay, this is the nature of the mind. Ahamkara is always making everything about itself. That action is always happening. And prakriti is constantly dividing. So just to give you a kind of a real example of how this is happening, the gunas flow through ahamkara and then through your senses. But the gunas are always influencing that. So if you have a lot of tamas in your eyesight, this energy is dominating your eyesight, you'll see the tree decaying, you'll see it rotting, you'll see it collapsing. If you see have a lot of sattva in your eye, you'll see the fecundity of it, the vibrance of the tree, the liveliness of the tree, the structure of the tree. So this is how the gunas influence our experience of the world. Now, when we observe something, you create an impression in the mind. These impressions are like thought forms. They flow in the system. They embed in our unconsciousness. This is happening all the time. And most of the time, these are neutral. These are small. They don't have a lot of power. Sometimes we have a tragedy or we have a stress, and it creates a samskara which is impacted with power and emotion, and it becomes a part of our nature. It becomes a part of our tendency or our personality. These samskaras inform buddhi, and ahamkara forms even tighter our human identity. So this delusion is like a feedback loop system, and it keeps happening. And it keeps bringing us further and further into illusion. So a bit like a river, these samskaras, our prana flows through us, but these samskaras get in the way and they change the flow of the river. So what is really, really important? So I had to frame all of that to explain the nature of the psychology, the nature of matter, the nature of the mind, to describe why certain preliminary practices are super important. We have this concept of wholesome and unwholesome behavior. Wholesome within the Buddhist context simply means anything which is bringing the experience back to the self all the time, bringing your worldly interaction back to the self all the time. So an unwholesome behavior would be like doubt, sensual desire, desire for form, pride, agitation, ignorance, individuality. So making everything about oneself all the time. Those would create or impact or compound the ego to make it more tamasic. A wholesome state would have patience, generosity, friendliness, honesty, contentment in it. This creates a sattvic perspective, a sattvic mind. Now, the thing with the sattvic mind is that it's transparent. You can see through it. The thing with the tamasic mind is that it's thick. You can't see through it. It is the very nature of ignorance. So these behaviors are what create suffering, psychological suffering. As we are prakriti, we continue to divide and we continue to get drawn into the nature of this division and the self, and our suffering becomes more intense. This is when patterns of behavior just become too repetitive, when a job can grind you down, when the same behavior patterns which make us feel sad and upset, or why me, these can cause tamasic mind states and bring us further into illusion or delusion. We become separate states of self, and this is the nature of the mind. It does this, and it binds us to a lower plane of existence. So a tamasic mind can't see it only sees the separateness of the self. It doesn't. It creates an identification with further bondage. So this is the reason why we reincarnate into another life, time after time after time again. Eventually, the spirit gets fed up and decides, I've had enough of this suffering. There's got to be a way out, and there is. What happens in the body is, with all of this tension, the mind contracts, it physically contracts. The reptilian brain starts to activate. The fight or flight responses get exhausted. The rational mind can't really kick in because the body is exhausted. The mind is constantly thinking about the self. The digestive parasympathetic nervous system has to work so hard because of stress. The body gets tired, worn down, the immune system breaks down, and we become ill. So we have to really start to climb out of these tamasic states. We have to. This is the nature of practice. This is what yoga and Buddhist meditation intended. So very much what can happen in spontaneous awakenings is this blast of Kuṇḍalinī energy can happen. People kind of get a peek above the tamasic plane and see the nature of reality, but then what happens is they can collapse and go back into this tamasic state. So we have to work hard at clearing the grounds, purifying the self, so that we can reside permanently in this sattvic state. So I want to talk about karma, and this is in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So karma, it really is causality. It's the psychological fruit of your action. Okay, so whatever you say, whatever you do, whatever you think, okay, the fruit that arises in your mind, the thoughts that arise in your mind are karma. Okay, it's a psychological condition that arises in your mind, not the circumstances. So you could be in a really rubbish circumstance, yet the mind is fine. So you have good karma. You could be in quite a pleasant circumstance on a beach with a cocktail somewhere, and the mind is worrying and upset about something. So that would be a negative karma. So it's not the conditions necessarily, it's the state of mind that arises. So your samskaras arising, that's your karma, arising to the surface. They're like living emotions. They have a life to them. They respond to the environment, and they attract similar latent samskaras to the mind. So this is causality. It attracts and raises up all the other times you felt that pain or that joy. They come together. So it's natural for the mind to focus on the samskaras, remembering the nature of ahamkara, that kind of reflexive me thing. But what happens is these samskaras get bigger when we feed them. They can be good or bad, these samskaras. We don't want to get caught up in the karma as it arises. We need to find a way to reverse this. So this is quite difficult to do sometimes. Sometimes you get a big chunk of samskara rise up in the consciousness, and it's a bit like the part of the river where you're about to tip over the edge of a waterfall. You just can't catch it anymore. It's too late. You said that dumb thing. You've done that horrible thing. It's too late. So the purpose is to cultivate the mindfulness, the steadiness, the concentration to catch it before you say it or do anything dumb, and you can stop or reverse that karma. So according to the Yoga Sutras, when the karma arises, it has this the qualities of the gunas within it. In that moment that it arises, you have the opportunity to flip it about, to nullify that karma. If it's a negative karma, if you have anger arise in the mind towards someone else, you have the opportunity to turn that around by thinking a loving, kind thought about that person that will nullify that negative karma. If you go along with that thought of negativity, of bad vibes, you get stuck in, you get more angry, you make that samskara bigger, stronger, and that sets in, that carves its way into your personality, to your being. So the idea is to eliminate this, to stop that flow of karma arising, creating more and more negative emotions, to produce more and more negative karma. And obviously, we rejoice in the positive karma that arises in us, and we, rather than crave it, which makes it tamasic, you kiss the joy as it flies, so to speak. Now, remember the difference between the sattvic mind and the tamasic mind. The sattvic mind is clear, is transparent. You can see through it. You can see the nature of reality with a sattvic mind. The tamasic mind clouds our insight. So these concepts are relevant to a healthy awakening because they frame our understanding and the significance of preliminary practices. They give us hope, what lies beyond the challenging parts of awakening. I've spoken to many people who struggle, who are struggling with their awakening. Their Kuṇḍalinī is wakening up, and a lot of the other stuff is coming up with it. So the challenge is, right, where do we start? What do we do? And how much agency do we have? Often it's known that people just ride the experience and it happens naturally, and that certainly is the case. What I've observed with people over maybe a couple of decades is that is the case when Kuṇḍalinī is very, very active in the individual, but then it is also the responsibility of the individual to refine the behavior. The mind can collapse back into tamasic states. So we have to constantly work at this. This is lifetime effort and work, devotion towards the path of awakening. So I believe that these frameworks are a healthier way of supporting the transpersonal experience rather than pathologizing these anomalous states. I feel that it's really important that we can bring these frameworks into Western psychology to support people. There's a book in Western psychology called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health. I think it's that. And it diagnoses people's mental illness. It kind of pathologizes human experience, which I think can cause psychological damage further on. So the idea is to find a way to incorporate these extremely beautiful, far out human experiences, which are so important for humanity, and find ways of integrating that into our current psychological understanding, as well as how do we function in the world. Now, I want to describe to you some of the states that the Buddhists describe in deep, deep, deep states of insight. And these states are really important to go through. They indicate a lot of progress on the path. They're called the 16 stages of insight. So this is a possible framework when we're looking at people having experiences of disillusion. These 16 stages of insight are knowledges produced when you start to witness the self dissolve. This is framed in Buddhist insight meditation practices, particularly in the Theravadan tradition. So it's a living tradition. So if you go to monasteries up in Burma, Paok Sayadaw teaches this path. A lot of the insight practice is the practice which differentiates Buddhism from other practices. It talks about the way that we so it talks about the way that the mind dissolves and how the psychology changes when you watch the mind dissolve. And they reach into the very heart of our existence, insight into the very heart of our existence. The experience is really fundamental for this radical transformation to take place, where the mind no longer craves and it no longer has any aversion. Okay, so this is the very near end of becoming an arahant, to see these stages of disillusion. This is in the Buddhist tradition. I haven't really found it in the yogic tradition, but I would love to hear any information if anyone has found anything. Sorry, it's a lot of writing here, but these are the 16 stages. I won't go through them in detail, but what is important to know is that as you start to witness the body dissolve, the mind dissolve, the self dissolve, and it does it gradually, it can be terrifying. So like staring into the void, and the void starts staring back at you. The mind gets very scared. The self gets very scared. The feeling of, oh my God, is this not only death, but annihilation of the self completely? So some people get very afraid. The fear is the necessary part of really examining how the mind works. So when you're deep in meditation, examining the nature of reality, you start to see the way the mind will latch onto something and create it for itself, but you watch it as though you're watching it under a microscope. And you watch the fear arise. You look at the textures of fear, depression, all of those things. That creates an aversion towards worldly behavior. This aversion allows you to unattach from it and stop clinging to it. This is when one can become an arahant, an enlightened being. Now, I don't know how appropriate that is if you have a family and you need to raise children and you have a job and you've got to pay rent. So this is why people normally at this stage have renounced everything in their life and they just do this. People in their normal lives sometimes have these experiences, especially now that mindfulness practice has become very popular as ways to calm anxiety. They're not looking to dissolve the self, they just want a bit of peace and quiet in their mind. But sometimes they get very good at the practice, they start to dissolve, and they go through the 16 stages of insight, and this can be alarming. What the fourth stage, arising and passing away, is when a lot of the Kuṇḍalinī stuff starts to happen. This is in the Buddhist tradition. One sees light, one sees the body illuminate, have knowledge of the scriptures, rapture, delight, calmness, faith, energy, equanimity, all of these things like just spontaneously arise. Now, sometimes people mistake this bit for becoming an enlightened being. And what can happen is that ahamkara still grabs onto it, creates a samskara out of it, and a kind of pride or delusions of grandeur can occur as a result of having this experience and not approaching it in the appropriate way to remain unattached, humble, letting go of the experiencing, moving on and to the next stage. People get hung up on it, come off the path, and they think that's it. In Soto Zen, they call it Zen demons start to arise. This is pride of spiritual progress. So we have to be very mindful of this. In Buddhism, they call these the 10 imperfections of insight. You have to be very careful not to get attached to them. And typically, the Kuṇḍalinī experience is so profound, so mind-changing, life-changing, that of course people get attached to them because they're like, whoa, what was that? And it changes their life and they want to pursue it. So we must find ways to prepare the ego before we go into these states. And this is what the path prepares us for. To guard against psychological hindrances. Now, I apologize for sounding so negative. Lawrence gave such an incredible, beautiful description of Kuṇḍalinī, and that so very much is the case of Kuṇḍalinī. What I am focusing on is the human behavior that happens sometimes with it. And of course, this is not the case for all people. Some people naturally go through these states and experience a smooth transition, a beautiful connection with the divine, and function in a healthy way in relationships and their world. My talk is really about how do we prepare the ego. So some of the, as well, to highlight, for people to be mindful when they're in these deep states. So some of the hindrances which can arise are pursuit for the high. This can cultivate greed. For heightened experiences, delusions of grandeur, people get deity possession, or one starts to identify with a god, which in some cases is okay if the ego is in a healthy space. Emptiness disease is like when you enter into these non-dual states, the individual starts to neglect their own behavior. They believe that nothing matters anymore, so they can do what they want. The karma is nullified. That doesn't matter. So this can be a dodgy place to get into. Deep psychological patterns arise to the surface. Samskaras come up. It's advised to go and look at maybe past trauma, work that out in a careful way when this happens. If people are entering into samadhi states, without pratyahara, without drawing the prana into the central column, or entering into certain meditative states which are a bit tamasic, there's a disassociation that can happen with your physical needs. Taking a bath, eating well, paying attention to your world around you. So this can be a dangerous place to be. Jadedness. This can happen when an individual starts to isolate themselves to meditate. If there's not enough, if there's a deficiency in love in the individual, this can cause apathy and carelessness or a jadedness with the world, with people. So Sangha, your spiritual community, is very important. Loving kindness with friends on the path is so important. Sometimes people start the spiritual path because they've had enough of their suffering, and their interactions with their relationships have caused a lot of suffering. So it's really important to cultivate the right mind before we enter into these states. Regarding the behavior of spiritual teachers, it's so important. It's so important that the student is aware of red flags. In the tantric tradition, it is traditional to hand your power over to a guru, but within the tradition, you also watch that guru for a couple of years and decide, is that appropriate? Is this guru the one for me? As well, the teacher watches the student for a couple of years before they commit to each other. This is really important to make sure that the connection is right and healthy. What can happen sometimes is teachers attain very high states of meditation, yet unbeknown to themselves, they have developed certain meditation sicknesses. So it's really important that teacher has wholesome attitudes to pass on. We put a lot of power into teachers, and it's important to be able to have the discernment to see that those teachers are born from love, intentions of care, intentions of grace, for the benefit of others. There's a lot of documentation of the Mahasiddhas, or crazy wisdom, it's called in the Vajrayana tradition, and this is beautiful. This is enlightened minds that haven't taken the upaya, the progressive stage. They've just become enlightened. They've seen the emptiness and the nature of everything, and nothing matters anymore. The problem is with following that is one hasn't necessarily reached stages of insight to see the emptiness and the nature of everything, and they cause more problems on their way, and the mind becomes more tamasic, and they never actually reach that state. So the idea, if one is making a conscious decision to move along this path, then we do a graduated safe way. So the structured path of spiritual development, I feel that the ancients have a lot to say about the necessary preliminary stages. By preparing our psychology, there are ways, they teach ways to resolve your trauma as it arises, when Kuṇḍalinī happens or when deep meditation happens. Our current Western therapies are wonderful. We've got CBT, transactional analysis, polyvagal theory, polyvagal soothing techniques. These are the new things that are coming out now. Internal family systems, transformational chair work. There's a wonderful 10-minute descriptions of all of these therapies on a website, or you can on YouTube, called Lewis Psychology. You can have a look at all these different Western means to resolve trauma. They're great with resolving trauma, but they don't necessarily integrate disillusion, altered states of consciousness into everyday ways of being. They don't pave a path towards that experience. So going back to right conduct, cultivating a sattvic mind with wholesome thoughts and speech is so important, nullifying the negative karma as it arises, purifying the self, lessening the trauma in the heart, reducing the fight, flight, freeze, fawn experience or response is super important. You want to quieten down the amygdala first, reshape the brain. We need to rewire the brain so we're no longer acting out of our lizard brain, our fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. We have to operate, we have to work those behaviors out of the system. So again, back to our guna list. We can start by acting sattvic, eating pure food, acting out of generosity, friendliness, being healthy, cultivating the wholesome thoughts. These are a good baseline to start with. In Buddhist practice, we have the 10 paramitas. Now, this is the later Mahayana practice that after Theravada Buddhism. The Mahayana from the Vajrayana path really emphasizes these 10 paramitas, 10 perfections as a path to perfect transcendence, to enlightenment. These qualities are associated with the bodhisattvas, the final achievements. They have endless generosity, virtue, renunciation, transcendental wisdom, effort, patience, truthfulness, determination, and friendliness. These are abundant qualities that just pour out the heart. Now, if these don't flow naturally in the individual, you can cultivate them. They might seem false at first and fake and rigid, but they start to take precedent in the mind. They start to arise in the mind more naturally, more spontaneously. This is causality. So that sattvic generosity, virtue, renunciation, that has a ripple effect. It has a cause for the next samskara to arise, which will also be of sattvic nature. As you continue on this path with these sattvic minds, you eventually arrive at a type of samadhi, deep absorption. So it's these states of mind which allow you to tip into very easily into samadhi, which is precisely the state we want to get into to unhook ourselves from the ahamkara doing its thing. We want to purify ahamkara. So one of the practices in I believe Lawrence talked about this earlier, in the Theravadan tradition, also in the later Mahayana tradition, is loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. I want to explain what these mean. So loving kindness, you cultivate a sense of warmth towards others. You know, it's like a friendliness. It's non-sexual, it's platonic, it's unconditional. Compassion is when you see someone suffering and you really care, you really want their suffering to stop. That's compassion. You see this, not pity. This is very different. Pity has a sort of condescending attitude to it. You want people to be free of their suffering. You genuinely want their suffering to stop. Empathetic joy. This is when you feel joy for someone else's success. You watch them succeed and there's a joy in your heart from watching them succeed. Equanimity. So in order to cultivate these, we need equanimity. This is like when you don't feel happy or sad by someone else's thoughts or feelings. You remain calm, level, balanced. Okay, so just still in the mind. So if someone's angry at you, you can stay equanimous. If someone's enamored by you, you stay equanimous. It's keeping the mind balanced. You cultivate these through practices. You generate these ideas, these thoughts in your head by concentrating on that attitude. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger. You can look them up on YouTube, loving kindness practice, or the Brahma Viharas. There's lots of guided meditations on these. Now, the important thing is the path of enlightenment should be motivated by these attitudes, not for selfish endeavor. It's the safest way. We start to crave powers. We start to crave like Kuṇḍalinī excitement. We just feed the ego. The idea is that you want to feed a sense of compassion, loving kindness. This is the safest way to quiet the amygdala, to generate that causal ripple effect of good, pure sattvic thought in the mind. By doing these practices, you are literally rewiring the brain due to plasticity of the brain. You're training the mind to come up with a loving thought when that negative karma arises. By doing that, you are nullifying that negative karma, calming down any limbic reaction, any kind of lizard brain reaction, and you're relaxing the body, completely relaxing the body. All those tightening responses are starting to relax. You know, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn starts to reduce. We start to act out of genuine platonic love for others. So these practices, the loving kindness, they prepare the mind for meditation, but they also prepare the ego as well. I think a misunderstanding in Buddhist practice is that we must love and embrace everyone into our world, which is true. However, if you're being psychologically abused or physically abused, that is not a good idea. So a healthy psychology doesn't accept psychological or physical abuse into their heart, into their world. So it's important to know these red flags as they arise, to protect yourself, to develop calm, the fight or flight freeze. So a lot of us come from trauma. This is normal. This is human. And this is the nature of our reality, unfortunately. So we must protect ourselves before we open ourselves. We have to create a healthy sense of self, so we don't get drawn into unhealthy relationships, unhealthy behavior patterns. When we are more advanced and you genuinely can have anger thrown at you and not feel that flutter of fight or flight, then let them in. I think this is a really important thing to remember. And many people maybe get themselves into more trouble thinking they should be more friendly. Let them in. There is a way to be compassionate without getting hurt. So when we're developing on this stage, we need to be aware of where we're at. We need to be honest with ourselves and see what can we actually handle, what can we actually take, and how big is my love and how much do I have to give in this moment. So just looking at the time, I want to highlight to you, or go into Ashtanga yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga, as a kind of very quickly describe to you. I've talked about the mind, how the Buddhist practices will work on the mind, reshaping the mind, creating positive, wholesome thoughts. I'm going to go back now to look at the metaphysical states, the layers of our being, the physical, the social, the pranic body. So these are all the subtle bodies that operate and function when Kuṇḍalinī is happening. I've got a few videos on my website that describe the subtle body process in more detail based on Indian texts, if you want to have a look at that. I'll just go through very quickly what we are doing when we practice the 8 limbs of yoga, and there is an ordered way that this is done. So it's a very common practice in India. The Patanjali Yoga Sutras are a kind of compilation of many texts from the past, including Buddhist ideologies as well. So it's a kind of gathering of lots of ideas condensed into one path of practice. Yama niyama, moral behaviors. I'll go through each one. What we're doing is you are purifying the physical body, your social sphere, then your physical body, then your pranic body, then your subconscious, and then you're preparing for meditative states. So there's an ordered way that we do this. We can't jump right into samadhi. We've got to work through the layers first until we can really get to enter into deep absorption. So the first layer, the first most important seed is ahimsa, non-violence. So everything has to be done with non-violence. So you have to check every thought, every action, every speech. Is there harm in that? Is there an essence of harm? Is there an intention of harm in that? And then speaking with truth and not stealing. That can also mean not trying to take energy from people. Take anything that isn't yours, in fact. Brahmacharya is a funny one. This is in the tradition in the early days. A lot of yogic practitioners would perform brahmacharya as chastity. That is usually when referred to when someone has a lot of passion that they find very difficult to control. So that would be a way to manage that passion, so they could channel that energy towards meditation. In Nat traditions, in Hatha Yoga, they would say you have to sow your wild oats first before you practice brahmacharya, because it can be very dangerous. These days, well, I suppose that the meaning has somewhat changed into managing your fire and your passion. So kind of learning to subdue, cooling that. A parigraha, that means non-grasping, non-possessiveness. So these are codes of behavior. We have to analyze ourselves and think, when am I doing that? How can I refine that? The next stage would be checking the clarity, your body, your mind. Your body affects the mind. If you've got a tamasic body, your thoughts will start to become tamasic. If you're watching horror movies or rubbish, or your mind will become tamasic by what you're putting into it. So you want to purify that. Just an acceptance where we are, understanding that this is where we're at. Be patient, and it will progress. That's santosha. Tapas is generating the discipline. This is very hard when you're tamasic. When the mind is tamasic, it's slothful, it's sluggish. It's very hard to motivate it. So you've got to generate tapas, energy, perseverance. That would be like, walking up that mountain and thinking, I can't go on anymore. And your mind goes, no, come on, build some tapas, get some self-discipline, get some energy. That will help you when it's tough. That will help you persevere when it's tough. Svadhyaya is studying the self, studying sacred texts, studying your own psychology, taking note of your own mental behaviors that arise. Ishvani Pranidhana, that's contemplating God. Now, this is a tricky one for the West because we have all concepts of religion and what God is. You can translate this as appreciation of the divine, devotion of to the divine. Once we've done that, once we've really checked ourselves, our behavior, taken into account our own interaction with the world and with ourselves, with self-respect, respect for others, all of that behavior, then you start practicing yoga, physical yoga, the asanas. The samskaras get lodged in the body and you feel it like a contraction in the muscle, like a stiff neck, hence the expression pain in the neck or things like that. The body will start to form the shape of where the samskaras are. It will tighten, it will tense. So the point of yoga is to become comfortable and measured and purify and clear out the physical tension that rests in the body so that you can sit with ease. The next layer would be to purify the pranic body. Okay, so the pranic body is the subtle life force that flows through us and animates every part of our being. The prana is a very subtle part of the mind. You can't start pranayama until you've done a good bit of yoga. If you do a lot of pranayama, these are breathing techniques, controlling the breath going in and out. If you still have a lot of tension in the body and you do pranayama, you'll raise a whole lot of emotions. So you do it gradually. You're soothing the self, you're soothing the breath, you're stilling the agitation of the samskaras in your, what they call the psychological winds that move through you. Once the basics are cleared, once your personal life is more or less functional, peaceful, healthy, safe, good, sattvic, then we can start to practice meditation. Meditation is very hard when we have a lot of drama going on or when the body is very tamasic. The mind won't stay still or stay absorbed. Once we've purified a certain layer of the being, oh, by the way, these numbers are the actual sutra in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Vyasa is the commentator. The sutras are very short aphorisms. Vyasa is a man who described the sutras in more detail. So when the mind is purified, you can start to practice with sensory withdrawal. You withdraw from the world. I'm aware of the time. You withdraw from the world and your mind can start to soften and meditate. You control the sense organs. The mind isn't looking out anymore, burning up your energy, consuming samsara. Then you can fix your mind on a specific point. They say to fix the mind on the nose, the tongue, the navel, the heart, or an object, a mantra, a flame, your breath, a sacred candle. The idea is you work with an object with just a little bit more subtle than where your mind is at. If your mind's busy, work with an object that is, if it's too subtle, you won't be able to concentrate. If it's just the right amount of subtlety above where your mind is, you'll be able to elevate to that level. So you gradually change your object of meditation until you can absorb yourself. You become more and more subtle until you get dhyana, which is when the mind is completely absorbed. and it flows like oil pouring from a stream. You get this sense of deep stillness and tranquility. When you can manage this for a long time, you enter into samadhi. This is when the mind is completely present with the object. So samadhi is a state where your senses are no longer observing that object. Something else is observing that object. Your buddhi is observing that object. Your senses aren't functioning. They're shut down, you've withdrawn. There's another aspect of the mind that is aware, that is absorbed in the object of your meditation. I'm flying through these because I'm very aware of my time. This is very similar. There's a lot of similar ideologies in the Buddhist structured path to what's called jhana meditation. I have some videos on that as well on my website that go into a lot more detail about jhana. What is important is developing this graduated path so that the mind can easily slip into samadhi states and experience Kuṇḍalinī in a refined way, and start to access deeper parts of the subconscious in a controlled way, so that we can start to see the nature of reality, develop psychic ability, if that is the path, without grasping, without craving, without ego, and allow the mind to evolve into its full potential. So I will skip to the end. I have a bit too much, I think I tried to squeeze in here, but as usual, I have described to you the way out of suffering according to Buddhism. Well, I didn't quite get to that bit, but really highlighting behavior as the bedrock for this path, accountability for behavior. It's the cornerstone to a fruitful society as well, free from corruption, material greed, which leads to pollution, war, and disease. It's the elimination of further trauma done to others. And it's the healing antidote for one's own trauma. So they're the way to deep meditative absorption and profound insight as well. And it's the protection against meditation sickness and spiritual emergencies. So I hope this talk was helpful, maybe a kind of very technical. Apologize for that. But yeah. Thank you so much for listening.
Yeah. You don't need to apologize about it being technical. You've certainly given us a whole lot to think about. Personally, myself, I have to really concentrate with all the foreign language and jargon in there. But the kernel of what you're talking about was just something that we can personally take away and really carry into the rest of the year, until you come back and talk to us again sometime. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pat, there was one question if we have time for it.
Do you want to key them up?
It's a very, the question was from spirology.com, and just wanting to know the link to different Western therapies assisting Kuṇḍalinī rising symptoms and insights.
Oh, okay. So it was it was very Western, so not necessarily assisting in Kuṇḍalinī, but for trauma, for personal trauma. So working out our egoic behaviors and patterns of behavior. So if we come from difficult situations, there's a great website, Lewis Psychology, Lewis Psychology. I'll post a link on my website. I've got a page with resources, so I'll put it up on my website if anyone is interested. It's at annmathie.com, and I'll put that YouTube channel on my resources for people to look at. So this isn't looking at transpersonal experiences, looking at sorting out our own personal relationships and things like that. So working through these new Western psychological therapeutic methods.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.